I have the privilege now of introducing our evening speaker, Bill Federer. We love Bill. He is just special to us, and we're fortunate to have him tonight. He already spoke 3 times today at our church at Calvary Chapel of the Harbor. He is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, president of America Search Inc., a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and by the internet. His Faith in History television airs on the TCT network, on station across America, and via DirecTV. We are honored to welcome Bill Federer.
Well, it is a big honor for me to be with you, and it is Gloria is doing such a tremendous job, and David Langman and all the rest of the team. So let's give the Lord a hand. Matter of fact, my mom was at Phyllis Schlafly's first meeting. Oh, wow. And I was driving ladies to Jefferson City, Missouri when I was a teenager and had a van full of ladies. And anyway, and I ran for Congress, and so she supported me, and then I spoke at international conferences, but she was a force. She would say, I want you to give the whole history of Islam in 15 minutes. Can you do it? It's like, yes, Phyllis. And I practiced that thing over and over again. I was timing, but anyway, so I want to give I wrote a book in 2006 on the history of Islam. It's called What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran. At the front of this book, I put a synopsis of that. So if you want to get this book, it's called Who is the King in America? And we have some over there. But let me just jump in. So, and I guess, should I use this mic? And then I can see my computer better. I might just, is this, not sure what, is this one work? Okay, this one works. We recently saw all those horrible attack on Israel and October 7th, and all the 1,400 in this article, but it's over 1,700 and more. Apologists assure us that the Islamist terrorists do not represent true Islam, but they're yelling Allahu Akbar, and they claim they do represent true Islam. So the question is, who can tell us what true Islam is? And one person, Muhammad, he was the best Muslim that ever lived, and his life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And so his life went through 3 stages, and we have to know these 3 stages to understand what's going on today. And can you hear me okay? So the first, he was a religious leader, then a political leader, then a military leader. And so Muhammad was born in 570 AD. And at this time, you had the Roman Empire is Christian, and its big enemy is Persia. And so these were the 2 superpowers. This was like the Cold War with the U.S. versus the USSR, but back then it was the Byzantine Christian Roman Empire against the Persian Zoroastrian Empire. I mean, they had 1,000 years of war, but this is pre-Islam. And so these 2 superpowers beat each other up and leave a power vacuum. And into that comes Islam. And so Muhammad was born in 570 AD. His father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 6 years old. His grandfather and guardian dies when he's 8 years old. He's orphaned, taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who's a merchant who takes Muhammad on camel rides. He goes to different cities, hears about different religions. Goes to Persia and hears about the Zoroastrian religion, where paradise is filled full of virgins that fulfill all the guy's desires. And then he goes to the pagans in Arabia. They had 360 different pagan gods. The most popular was Hubal, the moon god, and their calendar began with the first sight of the crescent moon over the desert, and that gets incorporated into his belief system. Anyway, then some Christian stuff, some Jewish stuff, some Manichaeism stuff, and
he is 25 years old. He's working for a wealthy widow named Khadijah. She's 40. She's widowed twice. She marries him. Now he doesn't have to work, and he goes out to caves and prays, which is what the Christians were doing. It's called pietism. The Egyptian fathers, they would build platforms in the desert and climb on top and bake in the sun, thinking they're denying their faith, their flesh, and getting holier, or they would go into caves and pray. And so Muhammad decides he'd go into cave and pray, and a spirit squeezes him and commands him to read. He said, I cannot read. Spirit squeezed him a second time, said, read. He said, I cannot read. Spirit squeezed him a third time and said, read. He said, I cannot read. Finally, the spirit threw him down and sat on him, and he began to recite. And that's how the Quran came to Muhammad. The word Quran means recitation. It's an oral thing because Muhammad and his original followers were illiterate. And so you had... So you said, how can somebody that's illiterate memorize all these verses? Well, in Arabic, they had a rhyme to them, very similar to rap music today. And Thomas Carlyle wrote on Heroes and Hero Worship, 1840, Arabs see more method in it than we. Much of it is rhythmic, a kind of wild chanting. And so Muhammad did not read the Old Testament because he could not read. But he heard the oral traditions, the Talmud, the Mishnah, and he did not read the New Testament. He thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Nobody explained to him the Holy Spirit. Even Encyclopedia Britannica stated the gospel was known to him chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. And so 610 AD, he goes into Mecca, and he is preaching his new faith, and the thought is that there's something in it for everyone. Something for the Jews. He originally had his followers buying toward Jerusalem for 17 months, but then when the Jews rejected him, he switched the direction to Mecca. Something for the pagans, something for the Christians, something for the Zoroastrians. He only makes 70 converts in 12 years, and he begins to get confrontational. And so the people of Mecca consider him a disturber of the peace. They chase him out of town in 622 AD. He tries going to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him. They pelt him with rocks and stones. So he goes to a Jewish city called Medina. They're nice. They're tolerant. They let him in as an immigrant. And he is, in a sense, the first Muslim immigrant. And he goes into the minority neighborhoods, and he organizes a following in the poor neighborhoods. And when the following gets big enough, he goes to the Jewish leaders and pressures them to accommodate him and his followers with a treaty. And so now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. And then his followers are chased out of Mecca. The people of Mecca considered them disturbers of the peace. So now you have lots of Muslim immigrants, lots of refugees. They go to Medina, and they're let in as Muslim immigrants. And Muhammad allows them to rob the caravans headed back to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. And so the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to escort and protect their caravan. Muhammad, with 300, defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badra in 624 AD. He's outnumbered 3-1, and he wins. So he takes this as confirmation from his Allah that he's supposed to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. The Battle of Badra, 625. The Battle of Uhud, expulsion of Banu Nadir. The Banu means clan. The 626 attack on Banu Mustalik, 627 Battle of the Trench. What's that? The Meccans send 10,000 soldiers to Medina to stop Muhammad from robbing caravans. Muhammad digs trenches all around the city of Medina, which renders the Meccan cavalry useless. You can't charge your horses and camels across a field full of potholes and trenches while you're being shot at from the walls. And so the Muhammad goes to some of these Meccans at night, bribes them, and the next morning they slipped away. Goes to some of the other Meccans at night, threatens them, and the next morning they slipped away. Now there's only a small group left, so it's sort of the bribe and the bullet, the silver or the lead, right? And then it gets freezing cold for a week. The rest of the Meccans lose heart and decide to retreat, go back to Mecca. Muhammad considers this a great victory. And so he goes back into the city of Medina, and there's no one left to protect the Jews. And so he chases them out and then kills others. I'll tell you about that. 630 AD, he finally conquers Mecca, And then the siege of Al-Taif, and he was using catapults and hurling rocks into the city. And they told Muhammad that these rocks were smashing and killing innocent women and children. And his response was, they are among them. So they got to be killed too. So the idea of killing innocent women and children to advance Islam goes all the way back to Muhammad himself. And then several of the subjugation of the Ghassanids, who were Arab Christians, so the Hadith, and so there's the Quran, private revelations to Muhammad. The Hadith are stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. There's 60,000 Hadiths, and they're all hearsay. Like Ibn so-and-so heard Abu so-and-so say that he heard somebody say that he heard somebody say that Muhammad said this. And there's different ones that they classify as more trustworthy than others, and the Sunnis like some, and the Shiites like others. And anyway, one of the hadiths is Malik Muwada, and he said when the messenger of Allah sent out a raiding party, he would say to them, make your raids in the name of Allah, in the way of Allah, fight those who deny Allah, do not steal from the booty. And then, a hadith Sahih al-Bukhari, Muhammad said, the person who participates in the holy battles in Allah's cause will be recompensed by Allah, either with a reward or booty, if he survives, or will be admitted to paradise if he's killed. What does he get in paradise? Lots of booty. And then Quran, Surah 33:50, Prophet, we have made lawful to you the slave girls who Allah has given you as booty. And then Surah 8:41, whatever you take as spoils of war, lo, a fifth thereof is for Allah and for the messenger of Allah. So Muhammad got a fifth of the booty. And the jihad fighters were allowed to have 4 wives, plus as many extra women as their right hand possesses, as many as you take in battle. So you can have 4 wives plus extra women. And so Muhammad transitioned from being a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader. Easy way to remember is RPM, like in your car, revolutions per minute, RPM. And so there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam's not just a religion, because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was also a political and a military leader. So the effort to split the militant side away from the religious side is you're trying to split Muhammad, because he was all 3. Now, one of the attitudes was victimhood, where he claimed the people of Mecca were intolerant of him, and he was the victim of their intolerance. Therefore, he was justified in robbing the caravans headed back to Mecca. This is a departure from Jesus, where Jesus said, if you have evil things done to you, you do not retaliate, you forgive. All right? And it says that, you shall be forgiven. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So Jesus is teaching forgiving, and Muhammad's teaching retaliating. But it's not just retaliating, it's retaliating on you and blaming you for it. So in Islam, they rape a woman, it's the woman's fault for tempting the man. If they think that you're intolerant of them and they attack you, it's your fault. And so it's Sigmund Freud called this psychological projection, and where the attacker blames the victim. It's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him. Nero set fire to Rome and blamed the Christians, right? I mean, so it's, Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, wrote, Muhammad put into the Quran not religious doctrines only, but political maxims, criminal and civil law. So it's not just a religion, it's also a political and a military system. One of these surahs is cut off the hands of thieves, whether they are male or female, as punishment for what they have done, a deterrent from Allah. In America, we have, there's no cruel and unusual punishment. Here's Surah 24:2. A woman who has been raped is also punished with 100 stripes. Again, because she allowed Satan to use her as a tool to tempt the man. And so she has to wear the burqa to look unattractive on purpose. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson wrote Law in the Middle East, 1955. Islamic law offers the American lawyer a study in dramatic contrasts. Its striking features relative to our law are not likenesses, but inconsistencies, not similarities, but contrarieties. The law of the Middle East is the antithesis of Western law. And so in America, you punish the person that committed the rape. In Islam, they punish the woman who's been raped. And two sets of verses in the Quran. Is you still with me? I want to cover this part quickly because I want to get to the modern age, what's going on today, but I feel like it's important to give this background. So there's two sets of verses in the Quran based on the two cities Muhammad lived in. In Mecca, he was a religious leader, so the verses he gets from his Allah in Mecca are a little more peaceful. The verses he gets in Medina are political and militant verses, and those are a little more political and militant. And the later verses supersede the earlier verses. By way of comparison, in the Bible, we have two sets of verses, Old Testament, New Testament. Old Testament has some violence in it, Moses and David, attacking and so forth. New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anybody. And so what do Christians say? Well, the later example is the one we're going to strive to imitate, right? Same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first. When Muhammad was a religious leader in Mecca, they're called weak verses, and they're superseded by the later verses that he gets in Medina. They're called strong verses. They're political and militant. And so the last example Muhammad left was the political and militant one. So 627 AD, I mentioned the Battle of the Trench. And then after the Meccans retreat, he goes back into the city, and there were 3 Jewish clans that were in the city that let him in. He gets offended at one of them, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. The other 2 clans keep their heads low and say, well, maybe he's not going to notice us. Now there's only 2 Jewish clans left. He gets offended at the weaker one and confiscates their property, chases them out of town, and the big one was like, well, they were always sort of competition to me, and as long as Muhammad's not touching us, we're okay. Well, now there's only 1 Jewish clan left, and the Hadith says Muhammad was taking a bath, and an angel appeared to him and says, how can you rest when Allah's enemies are in your midst? He said, where? And the angel points to that last Jewish neighborhood. So Muhammad bottles them in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they surrender, he brings them into the market and chops off the heads of the men, about 600, and sells the women and children into slavery. So within 5 years of Muhammad coming as an immigrant into a Jewish city, within 5 years there's not a Jew left in the city. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within the next 5 years of Muhammad's death, he dies in 632 AD, every pre-existing culture in Arabia is wiped out. And so it's a 3-step process, like Caesar's Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. His is immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate into the host country as a religious refugee, and then increase the number of your followers in the minority communities and become politically involved, and then random outbreaks of violence, and people no longer feel safe. They move out of those communities, and then they take over. And so Henry Ford, the story is that he was traveling in the Middle East, and somebody was helping him with his luggage, and he said he was a hard worker, and he says, show up in Detroit, I'll give you a job. And because Henry Ford did not like unions, and the unions were organizing and everything, and so these Arabs would not join the unions, and so he thought, hey, I'll show those unions, I'll bring it. So he bring them in, and the whole generation or two, they were just hard workers. But now the younger generation is become more radicalized, and they're getting involved. And so this is a news article, Fox, and it says, members of the first U.S. majority Muslim city council warns today we showed the Polish. Last week in Michigan City and Hamtramck elected new city council, and they ushered in the first Muslim majority city council in America. And now they have calls to prayer 5 times a day. And now they're also doing it in Minneapolis. And so there's a 1,400-year track record to observe this, immigrating as a religious refugee, a little more peaceful, and then growing in numbers and getting involved politically, and then having random outbreaks of violence that causes the previous inhabitants of the neighborhood to no longer feel safe, and they move out. 1,400-year track record, and it's broken into 3 springs. We use that term Arab Spring, but it's 3 periods of Islamic expansion. The first is Arab Persian from 622 to 1071. The second is a Turkish 1071 to 1923 after World War I. And the third was the Arab Spring, 1928, with the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, jumping in, the goal of fundamentalist Islam is a one world government called a caliphate. So the leader, the messenger of Allah, Muhammad, the successor of the messenger of Allah is called a caliph. And the area that he controls is the caliphate. And their goal is to have a global caliphate. And it's interesting that a military invention came along at this time. So you have the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire beating each other up, leaving a power vacuum. And then Islam comes along, but there's a new invention called the stirrup. It was invented by Mongolian nomads. They had little short horses, and they would tie a rope around the horse and leave two loops hanging for their big toes. They would ride barefoot, and that helped them keep balance. And then that invention made its way to China, and then across the Gobi Desert, the China Silk Road, to Persia. The Persians made the stirrups out of metal with leather straps. This allowed you to have more control in the saddle. You could actually stand up in the saddle, and you could put the full power of a galloping horse behind your sword. Now, the Europeans used these big, heavy metal swords that you took two hands, and you've seen pictures of them, right, with the knights, and it was like, there's something called Damascus steel. It was a new invention where you take the steel and you bend it over on itself and hammer it down, bend it over itself, hammer it down. Just keep doing it over and over again. It gets thinner and thinner and stronger, where the European swords are forged. They pour the hot metal in there, right? And so these scimitar swords were curved and they were light, like a razor blade. So they could hold the reins of the horse in one hand, the scimitar sword in the other, their feet in the stirrups, and at a full gallop, they literally could slice someone in half. And you cannot outrun a charging horse. It was the fastest thing on the battlefield. They were unstoppable. And so here is the U.S. Supreme Court chamber in Washington, D.C. It has lawgivers throughout history. It does have Moses and the 10 Hebrew Commandments. It has John Marshall, the fourth Chief Justice. And it has Muhammad with his Arabic sword, the Quran and this scimitar sword. And this is Muhammad's sword. It still exists in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey, which is right next to the Hagia Sophia, which was the church that was turned into the mosque. And matter of fact, if you go there, they have a whole room full of swords from all the caliphs, right? Abu Bakr and Muawiyah and Caliph Ali. I mean, a whole room full of swords. And one of Muhammad's generals was Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was nicknamed the Drawn Sword of Allah because he was undefeated in 100 battles. And anyway, within 23 years of Muhammad's death, the Muslims conquered Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom, down there at the bottom of Arabia. They conquered into Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. They conquered Syria, which was the first country to completely be Christian. Did you know that? The name Christian was first used in Syria. And then the Apostle Paul evangelized Syria. Then they invaded into Armenia, which had been Christian. And it still is Christian, but it's being attacked. And then they conquered into Egypt. Egypt had been Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, Libya. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. That's that part that's sort of right there. Today it's Tunisia. And the Christians had taught themselves their pietism. It was this movement that swept through Christianity that said, if you're really a Christian, you should give away all your money and live in a cave and be a hermit or join a monastery and take vows of silence. And so these Christians were getting saved, but what were they doing? They were withdrawing. And they were enjoying their personal relationship with God, right? And they were not involved in politics. They were not involved in government. They were not involved in protecting their culture. And Islam just bowls all through really fast. And so in 10 years, they conquer all of North Africa. In the year 711, they cross the Strait of Gibraltar and conquer Spain. Now, when they conquer all this so fast, it cuts off trade across the Mediterranean. And economically, Europe is brought to a screeching halt. And one of the items that's no longer traded is papyrus. These were reeds that grew along the Nile Delta that they would soak in water and then weave them together and make paper. And so when the Muslims conquered Egypt and held back the ships full of papyrus, there was a paper shortage in Europe. They wrote fewer books, and we call this the Dark Ages. And then the oldest library in the world was in Alexandria, Egypt. And they asked Caliph Umar what they should do with the books, and he said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy, and every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant, because we have the Quran, so destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. And so then there was the Muslim leader Tariq, and he, with his 80,000 soldiers, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and they land at a mountain. And the Arabic word for mountain is Jabal. So they called it Jabal Tariq. And if you say that a couple times, Jabal Tariq, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. So Gibraltar is Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. That's where the Muslims landed in the year 711 AD. And in 10 years, they conquered all of Spain, because Spain had all of these different kingdoms that were fighting amongst themselves. And then they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains. The Battle of Bordeaux in France. You have the Frankish army standing there on foot with their heavy metal swords. The Muslim cavalry comes, and in one pass, the cavalry annihilates the entire Frankish army. One pass, they turn around for a second, go at them, they're all dead. They were literally unstoppable. And so then there's the Battle of Tours with Charles Martel in 732 AD. He does not like the idea of standing in a field waiting for the cavalry, so he puts his men on top of a hill. And 30,000 of them, and packs them all together really tight, and it's hard to charge your horse up a hill, and horses hesitate charging into this pack of people. And then Charles Martel sent some men to sneak into the Muslim camp and free the booty, right? To free all the captives. And the warriors see the captives being let go. They leave the fighting to reclaim their captives, and the commander, Abdul Rahman, is yelling at them to get back to the fight. Abdul Rahman gets distracted. He gets killed. And now the Muslims cannot decide who their next commander is going to be. They pick up and they go back to Spain with their booty. And that's the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. It's a 100-year military campaign. Then they attack Constantinople half a dozen times, but they're turned back because the Greeks have Greek fire. It's where they mix oil and sawdust and shoot it out of a hot oil cannon, so it's sort of like napalm. And that was the first Arab-Persian Spring, right? They captured Baghdad, and then the Persians convert. And then you have the Turkish Spring, beginning in 1071. So you have the Huns, and then from that area of the world, you have the Mongols, but one of those Mongol, Turkic type of people groups were the Turks, and there's two waves, the Seljuk Turks and then the Ottoman Turks. And so some definitions are helpful. The word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah, and they think there'll be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So it is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of world peace is world Islam. When your enemies are defeated, there's nobody left to fight, there's peace. And so the word peace means something to us, but it means something different to them. Sort of like Lincoln during the Civil War gave a talk. He says, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing, right? The North says liberty, it's freeing the slaves. The South says liberty, it's getting rid of the northern soldiers. In Islam, the world's divided in two. The half that has submitted to Allah and the half that's in the process of submitting to Allah. So the Dar al-Islam is the house of Islam. It's submitted. And the house of war, the Dar al-Harb, it's supposed to be at war because it's in the process of being subdued. A moderate Muslim thinks the world will submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's even figurative. And since it's so far off, they really don't think about it. And they just want to live their lives and have you as a friend. And the fundamental Muslim thinks the world is supposed to submit to Allah now. And they're really excited. They want to help make it happen. Now, the dilemma for us in the West is when the West shows itself really, really nice, the fundamental ones view that niceness as weakness. And they take that as an invitation to attack. And so, interview with psychologist Nikolai Sennels, Muslims instinctively see our lack of reaction as fear. It is an invitation to attack. I talked to a Muslim gentleman who had become a Christian, and he said, when they sense that you are afraid of them, they take that as an indicator from Allah that they're supposed to attack you. Right? If they sense that you're afraid, they say, this Allah wants me to attack this person. It's interesting that the Bible over and over again says what? Fear not, fear not, fear not, fear not. You know, Gideon's got 10,000, whittles it from 30,000 to 10,000, and he says, tell everyone that's scared to go home. So God can do more with the fewer people that don't have fear, right? But now, when these terrorist attacks happen, they say that those killers don't represent true Islam because Islam says it's wrong to kill the innocent. Well, now we have to define the word innocent. Innocent is a faithful follower of the way of Allah. So if you're not a faithful follower of the way of Allah, you're not innocent. So Surah 3:32, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Surah 48:29, be ruthless to the infidel. Surah 9:123, make war on the infidel. Surah 9:29, fight those who believe not in Allah. Surah 2:191, kill the disbeliever wherever we find them. Right? And so if you are not a faithful follower, you are, it's ordered them to be aggressive against you. Now, the fundamental Muslim, the Islamist, is the word that's being used to describe them. The fundamental Muslim views the moderate Muslim as having left the way of Allah. So the fundamental Muslim is just as happy to kill a moderate Muslim as they are to kill an infidel. So the moderates are sort of between a rock and a hard place. Muhammad had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. He had slave wives and concubines and so forth. His youngest wife was Aisha. He had a dream 2 nights in a row of him marrying the 6-year-old daughter of his general, Abu Bakr. And he says, you're the prophet. Here she is. It consummates when she's 9. And Abu Bakr fought in all the battles that Muhammad fought in. And so he said, I know the way. I was with them. I know the way. And so the word the way in Arabic is Sunni. And so Abu Bakr is the founder of the Sunnis. 90% of Muslims are Sunnis. And they sort of believe differently depending on the local imam. And some are more moderate, some are less moderate. Muhammad had a daughter, Fatima. She's married to Ali. And the followers of Ali are called Shia or Shiite. And 10% of Muslims are Shiite, mostly in Iran. And so the fighting between the Sunni and the Shia is the fighting between the followers of the father-in-law versus the followers of the son-in-law. And the Shiites have an Islamic Mahdi who's going to come back, and he basically, you read the description, and it's the way the Christians describe the Antichrist. So when the Mahdi comes back, he's going to kill the Christians, kill the Jews, kill all the apes, and kill all the pigs. And so whereas the majority of Muslims are moderate, they think the world's going to submit in the future, maybe it's even figurative, you do have some fundamental ones like this guy, A. Jim Kadori, Islam for UK, and he said, we have had enough of democracy and man-made law. We call for a complete upheaval of the British ruling system and demand full implementation of Sharia in Britain. So there are some that actually do want to overthrow the laws. What is Sharia? It's trying to be like Muhammad. And so Christians want to be like Jesus, Muslims want to be like Muhammad. Pretty simple, except Christians do not believe they go to heaven by being like Jesus. They go to heaven because they believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all their sins. And they want to act like Jesus to show the rest of the world how much God loves them. Not so with Islam. They think their chances of going to paradise are directly proportional to how closely they can follow Muhammad's example. And that's why they read the hadiths and they see that Muhammad slept on his right side and cupped his hands under his head and he used a sandalwood toothpick and he wore a certain, robe. They want to copy him thinking that that's going to increase their chances of going to paradise, even though Muhammad himself said, though I'm the prophet of Allah, I do not know what Allah will do with me. So there's no security. And what Muhammad permitted is permitted. It is called halal. What Muhammad did not permit is not permitted. It is called haram. Muhammad liked cats. Cats are halal. They are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. They are haram. They are not permitted. So Islam is a long list of halals and harams, a long list of do's and don'ts, and the local imam keeps the list. And you can ask, well, why is this haram? I can't tell you that, but it's haram. But I really want to know, why is this haram? If you ask again, we'll kill you for doubting Islam. You don't even know why. You just obey. And so Islam comes from four main sources: the Quran, which is private revelations to Muhammad, and it comes in the Meccan verses, a little more peaceful, and the Medina verses that are more political and militant. A whole lot of Islam comes from the Hadith, these 60,000 stories remembered by his wives and warriors. There's the Sirat, or the biography of Muhammad, written 100 years after his death, and there are 1,400 years of rulings that go into four major schools of Islam, from more moderate to more fundamental. Slavery. Muhammad owned slaves, and he owned black slaves. And so they raided caravans, but then they raided ships, and they attacked the coast of Italy and France and England and Greece, and they would carry away captives. And so there were whole Catholic orders in Europe through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians. The head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would collect alms and donations and ransom back your friend. They even attacked the Baltimore, Ireland, and carried away a whole village and sold them into slavery in Morocco. And they they captured and enslaved about 180 million Africans. And then when Columbus discovers the New World, some of the greedy Spaniards enslaved Native Americans. And then when you have a Spanish priest named Bartolome de las Casas, contemporary of Martin Luther, but he gets the king of Spain to stop the enslavement of Native Americans. And so the greedy people say, where can we get more slaves? And someone said Africa. And so that begins this African slave trade, where they buy the Africans from the Muslim slave markets. Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, the Niger River, Khartoum in Sudan, Tanzania, the Zanzibar coast. These were all big Muslim slave trading posts. And then they would capture the boys and use them as coquettes, or the Muslim pederasty. I won't get into all that. But anyway. And even David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary to the Congo, he writes about being a missionary in Africa, and then he would go through a valley. A year later, he'd go through the valley ghost villages. What happened? The Arab slave traders came through. He says one time he stumbles across a path of like 1,000 Africans shackled together, being forced to march 500 miles to the coast to be sold into slavery. And if they walked too slow, they would just shoot them or tie them to a tree. He says you could tell where the slave trails were by the vultures circling. And he said, if anything of my writing can get rid of this monster that hangs over Africa, it'll be more important than discovering the source of the Nile River, because he was looking for the source of the Nile. But it still goes on today. Niger, Mauritania, Sudan, they still have slavery. And now, we talked about the three waves of expansion. The Arab Persian, then the Turkish, and then the recent one with the Muslim Brotherhood starting. When the Arab Persian expanded really fast, and then they're stopped at the Battle of Tours, and the Spaniards begin a Reconquista, a 700-year driving the Muslims out of Spain period. They're stopped at Constantinople with the Greek fire like napalm. They do expand further into India and down into Africa, but for the most part, they become moderate. And the Persians are a little bit more moderate, And the Syrian Christians were translating the Greek classics from Greek into Syriac into Arabic. And so you had Arabs reading Greek stuff, and they became scholars, and they studied math and science. And now they did not force the Christians and Jews to convert and become Muslims. Why? Because it was the Christians and Jews that were the tax base. The Muslims did not tax Muslims. And so once a year, the Christians, the non-Muslims, had to ransom their life with what's called the jizya. They had to pay an enormous ransom once a year. The stories of it were, they would, anyway, the time's slipping away. Is that 30 minutes left, or I'm into it 30 minutes? Oh, okay. So we got to go faster. So we go through. Al-Farabi was a moderate Muslim, and he incorporated science philosophy during Islam's golden age. Avicenna was a prominent Persian scholar. He wrote on medicine and math. And Averroes was a philosopher in Spain, and he wrote on Aristotle and everything. And if you were to take a snapshot of the world, you would have thought that the Muslims were about to experience the Renaissance. The Renaissance is what? A rediscovery of Greek stuff. And so it all gets slapped down by this guy, Ghazali. And he's a mujahideen, a renewer of the faith. And he says, stop reading Greek stuff. Because if you read the Greek philosophy, math and science, you could get into Greek philosophy, and then you could leave Islam. And so he writes this: one should restrain anyone who would immerse himself in these mathematical sciences, for even though they do not pertain to the domain of religion, yet since they are among the foundations of the philosopher's sciences, the students will be infected with the evil and corruption of these philosophers. So they stop. And so Europe opens up to the Renaissance, and they start universities. What about the Crusades? That's the Turkish Spring. Comparison: Jesus never killed anybody. Muhammad killed 3,000 people. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad owned slaves. Jesus never married. Muhammad had lots of wives. Jesus never tortured anybody. When Muhammad conquered Khaybar, the chief wouldn't tell where the treasure was, so they kindled a fire on his chest. Jesus did not permit lying. Muhammad permitted lying. It's called taqiyya. Jesus never forced anybody to follow him. Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. And Jesus forgave insults. Muhammad avenged insults. And Jesus didn't permit the disciples to rape anyone. Duh. Muhammad did, and there's always hadiths about it. Anyway, I could go on, but this is interesting. A verse that a friend of mine who ministers a lot to Muslims says this is the most effective verse to share the love of God with a Muslim. It's Isaiah 61. Jesus quotes it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. There is no concept in all of Islam that Allah wants to heal your broken heart. Allah could care less about your heart. Allah demands submission. And so when you share that God of the Bible cares about their heart, that often if you pray with them, they'll feel the presence of the Lord. And I've done it with several, and it's like, it softens their heart. Then the Vikings, they're pagans for a century or two, and then they become Christian Vikings, and then you got William the Conqueror conquers England, but then Richard the Norman, he conquers Sicily from the Muslims, and so then you have the Reconquista driving the Muslims out of Spain, El Cid. And then the Turks. So now we're getting into the Turks. And the Seljuk Turks invade into what is today Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation are wiped out by the Muslim Turks. And anyway, St. Nicholas is the most popular Greek saint. And he gave to the poor, threw money in the window of poor people, started this Greek tradition of giving money to the poor anonymously and the gift-giving stuff. Well, when the Muslims invade, they move the bones of St. Nicholas over to Italy, a little town called Bari, B-A-R-I, and the Pope dedicates the church, and the Pope is Urban II, and he goes to the Council of Clermont, 1095 AD, and begs these kings of Europe to send help to these Greek Orthodox Christians, and they send help. It's called the First Crusade. And there's 9 major crusades over 200 years. Richard the Lionheart led the Third Crusade. St. Louis led the 7th and 8th Crusades. He actually corresponded with Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And Hulagu Khan sacks Baghdad. And he takes the Sultan, and who's royal, and they don't want his royal blood to touch the ground. And so they wrap him in a Persian rug and have the horses trample him to death. And but he kills like millions of these. And but it's sort of sad because it was Hulagu Khan ends the Islamic Golden Age. And so the Mongols were attacking the Muslims the same way the Crusades were attacking the Muslims, and but the Crusades end, and then Tamerlane kills another 17 million, and then the Byzantine Empire is now shrunk, and all it is the city of Constantinople and some other close by areas. Sultan Mahmud II sends over his army, his navy, and they have this big cannon, and they sack Constantinople 1453, cutting off the land routes to India, turned the largest Christian church in the world into a mosque. And that's why Marco Polo in 1226 went from Europe over to China. Marco Polo, right? But when the Muslims conquer Central Asia, that's when Columbus looks for a sea route to get to India and China. And so the Muslims are invading Greece and Turkey, and so the scholars are now fleeing with their Greek stuff to Florence, Italy. And so this spreads the Renaissance in that direction. And they spread the Greek New Testaments, which lays the foundation for the Reformation. 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna. And then Spain is stopping the Muslims, and Spain has a competition with France. And so the King of France decides he's going to make a treaty with the Ottoman Sultan. So it's called the Franco-Ottoman Alliance, and it goes on for centuries, like 3 centuries. And so Spain is trying to stop the Islamic invasion, but now France is siding and arming them and equipping them and training them. And it's, anyway. So their Battle of Malta, the Battle of Lepanto, Miguel de Cervantes is captured, made a slave. And Vincent de Paul is made a slave. He escapes, and then he starts a hospital. And Captain John Smith, that helped found Virginia, fought the Muslims over in Hungary before he founded Jamestown. And Pilgrims, 1625, sent a ship filled full of beaver skins back to Europe, and the Muslim pirates captured it in the English Channel, took it to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And then there's the Battle of Vienna, September 11, 1683, stops the Muslims. And let's see. Napoleon invades Egypt, and the Barbary Pirate Wars, and lots of good stuff, but we're going to run out of time. So we get to this one, the Arab Spring, decline of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire in the late 1800s is being ripped apart, and European powers are taking control of it. And so by 1914, the green area is all that's left of the Ottoman Empire. And it's called the Sick Man of Europe. Abdul Hamid II is the Sultan, and he's got his 13 wives and 3 concubines. And the Armenians want to break away too, and he says no more breaking away, and he kills hundreds of thousands of Armenians. And so here's this picture of this journal, and it shows the Ottoman Empire, right, Turkey, and he's watching, the Britain and France and all these people, they're pulling away countries from the Ottoman Empire. And if left to itself, it would have collapsed. But then something happens, oil. So in the 1800s, where did oil come from? Well, before Pennsylvania, where did oil come from? Saudi Arabia, right? No, before that. Whales. And they would have whale oil lamps. And they would chase these whales around the world for their blubber and boil it down into oil. And they were almost wiped out until oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, 1859, and then in Oklahoma, and then in the Middle East. in Iran, and then in Kirkuk, Iraq, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. And so Winston Churchill changes the British Navy from coal to oil. But Britain only has one oil well in the Sherwood Forest, of all places. And so Britain decides to make a treaty with the Iranians, and they start an oil company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They later changed the name of it to BP. Look at this sign. They're taking down the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company sign, and they're putting up the British Petroleum sign. So BP is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and but Germany industrializes. There's no oil well, so they make a treaty with the Turkish Ottoman Empire because they have Kirkuk and Iraq where there's oil. And so half of World War I took place in the Middle East. And here is a picture of Kaiser Wilhelm II with Abdul Hamid II, and they're making a treaty. You provide us the oil, we'll give you the guns, right? And what do they do with the guns? They kill a lot of the Armenians. So Christian Bale did a movie called The Promise. It's a really good movie where it talks about these Germans going in there and whipping the Ottomans into their jihad frenzy, and they wipe out the Armenians. Anyway, so half of World War I is in the Middle East. The war ends. Woodrow Wilson wants us to create the League of Nations and join it. And the first thing the League of Nations was going to do was to come to the rescue of Armenia. And we say no because it's a globalist organization. And so between 1915 and 1922, you have the Young Turks. Have you ever heard that term, Young Turks? They were the three pashas, and they killed millions of Armenians. And they would march them into the desert. They killed Syrians, and this genocide. Teddy Roosevelt's trying to get America to come to the rescue, and we don't. And so after the war, Europe has its map redrawn. There's no more Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. Germany loses a whole bunch, Alsace-Lorraine or whatever. Well, guess what? They redraw the map of the Middle East. There's no more Ottoman Empire that's been around for 700 years. And so you have France taken apart, Italy once apart, Russia once apart, and Britain once apart. And it's called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And during the war, there was a Jewish chemist from Russia. Remember the Fiddler on the Roof? The Jews left Russia. Well, one of the families was the Weizmann family, and Chaim Weizmann. He's a chemist in London, in England. And the British are running short of explosives. You're fighting a war, you need explosives. And so he comes up with a bacterial fermentation process to make acetone, a needed solvent to make explosives. It's ethanol to butanol to acetone. And after the war, the British are so thankful, they want to make him a sir or a knight. And he goes, no, I'd really like a homeland for the Jewish people. And so you have the Balfour Declaration, where the Jews say, hey, we just got rid of the Ottoman Empire, and we have all this land. We're going to call it the British Mandate, and we're going to give it to the Jews. And now it's interesting that the idea of Jews going back and resettling the Holy Land came from Christians out of the Second Great Awakening revival. And so here is a book, Jeffrey Alderman, Jewish Chronicle. The Balfour Declaration was born out of religious sentiment. Arthur Balfour was a Christian mystic who believed that the Almighty had chosen him to be an instrument of the divine will, the purpose of which was to restore the Jews to their ancient homeland, perhaps as a precursor to the second coming of the Messiah. And then it goes, the declaration was thus intended, the Balfour Declaration, to assist in the fulfillment of the prophecy, biblical prophecy. This appealed to Lloyd George, believing in the prophecies of a Bible he knew inside and out. And then so you had the Second Great Awakening revival in America, and you had people called millennialists who discovered in the Bible that Jesus is going to come back as the Messiah and rule and reign for 1,000 years. And the word 1,000 is millennial. And so, but they said before this can happen, the Jews are supposed to be back in the Holy Land. And so here's the book, Prophets and Millennialists. And so these Christians in England would go to the synagogues and go to the Jews and would plant the seed. You guys need to think about going back there. And Anita Shapira wrote Israel a History, says the idea of Jews returning to their ancient homeland as the first step in world redemption seems to have originated among a specific group of evangelical English Protestants that flourished in England in the 1840s. They passed this notion on to Jewish circles. And so one of the Jews was Theodor Herzl, and he organizes the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And who attends? But Henri Henry Dunant, the founder of the International Red Cross, the first recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he's supporting the Jews going back. And Lord Balfour said, my personal hope is that the Jews will make good in Palestine, eventually found a Jewish state. It's up to them now. We've given them their opportunity. The British mandate is exactly the borders that God gave Moses. It goes from Syria and Iraq down to Arabia and Egypt, Mediterranean, right? And this guy throws a monkey wrench in the whole works. His name is Lawrence of Arabia. He's a lieutenant in the Cairo. And he's sent on a reconnaissance assignment to meet with the Arabs, the Sharif of Mecca, and see if the Arabs would be willing to help the British defeat the Turks. And rather than just reporting back, he takes it upon himself to promise the Arabs that if they will help the British defeat the Turks, they will get all the land in the Middle East. And so we have the same land promised to two different groups. We have the official Balfour Declaration. Because of Chaim Weizmann's contribution, the British say, we're going to give it to the Jews. And you got this Lawrence of Arabia on his own with no authorization and promising these Arabs. And Lawrence of Arabia admitted he lied to them. He writes in his book, Pillars of Wisdom, 1922, had I been an honest advisor to the Arabs, I would have advised them to go home and not risk their lives fighting for such stuff. I risked the fraud on my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East. And better we win and break our word than lose. For being a successful trickster and to prevent this unpleasantness arising, I began in my reports to conceal the true stories of things. Now, the British did break their word. They promised the Kurds, if they would help the British defeat the Turks, they would get their own homeland. Well, they didn't. And the Kurds to this day are just a minority in other countries. So, the same land is promised to two different groups. One group is authorized, the Balfour Declaration. One group is unauthorized, this Lawrence of Arabia making this promise. Well, the Arabs that believed Lawrence's promise was the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi. And he was Hashemite, which was the name of a clan that Muhammad was from. And so the Hashemite clan was in charge of Mecca from the 10th century on and all the holy places in Mecca. And believe it or not, the Hashemites were relatively tolerant because they had Muslims coming from around the world for their Hajj, 5 pillars of Islam. The 5th one is once in your life, you're supposed to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And they're coming from Indonesia, they're coming from all these places, and they don't all believe all exactly. And so it was like, okay, let's just get along. And so the Hashemites were more moderate. And And so the pilgrimage was more or less a traditional thing. And but here's the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi, and he's called a modernist. Again, he sought common ground for those inside and outside of Islam, known for peace building and interfaith cooperation. And so during the Armenian genocide by the Turks, the Sharif decreed April of 1918 that the Syrian land should, quote, protect and take good care of everyone from the Jacobite Armenian community living in your territories. Defend them as you would defend yourselves. They are the protected people of the Muslims. Right? So here's this Sharif. He's pretty moderate. And he has a son named Fazl. And Fazl was, after the British got all that land of the Middle East, they had part of it that was called Iraq, and they gave Iraq to Fazl, the son of the Sharif of Mecca. And he's more moderate. And in the movie with Peter O'Toole, Alec Guinness played the Fazl. And here's a picture of Chaim Weizmann, the Jewish chemist, and King Fazl. They were like friends. And here's what King Fazl wrote in 1919. We feel the Arabs and Jews are cousins, and having suffered similar oppressions at the hands of power stronger than themselves, we look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. Now, he thought he was also going to be king of Syria, in addition to Iraq, because of the promise of Lawrence of Arabia. Now, the Sharif of Mecca says in 1918, the resources of the country are still virgin soil and will be developed by the Jewish immigrants. that the country is for its original sons, for all their differences, a sacred and beloved homeland. So here is this Hashemite Sharif of Mecca, and again, he's welcoming the Jews back. And so this is the area that the Jews had, and then this is Iraq. And they're like, we can get along. And now Syria. So Fazl thought he was going to get Syria. But at the San Remo conference in 1920, France wanted the mandate for Syria. What's a mandate? It's like after the Spanish-American War, America has Puerto Rico as a protectorate, or the Philippines as a protectorate. We sort of watch over it and eventually give them their independence. And so France was given the protectorate or mandate for Syria. And rather than just say, okay, we're here to sort of help you, France comes in with an army, drives out Fazl and all of Fazl's people. And Fazl was like, I thought I was going to get Syria. And his brother Abdullah is going to do a guerrilla warfare against the French. And the British, Winston Churchill, is like, okay, look, Abdullah, Britain and France are sort of like friends, and so we don't want you attacking the French in Syria. So tell you what, we're going to take the land that we gave to the Jews and take 2/3 of it away. And we're going to create an Arab homeland called Transjordan or Jordan. And we're going to make Abdullah, the brother of Fazl, and another son of the Sharif of Mecca, we're going to make him the king of Jordan. So Winston Churchill puts Fazl as the king of Iraq. He thought he was going to be king of Syria and Iraq, but France takes Syria, so he's just king of Iraq. And then Winston Churchill takes 2/3 of the land that was given to the Jews, creates a brand new country called Jordan, and lets Abdullah be the king of that. But Abdullah even liked the Jews. And so here you have Abdullah with Winston Churchill, another picture with Winston Churchill, and then there's Abdullah. And this is what Abdullah wrote. He's the king of Jordan. He writes an essay, As the Arabs See the Jews, published in the American Magazine, 1948, before the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. He says, no people on earth have been less anti-Semitic than the Arabs. The persecution of the Jews has been confined almost entirely to the Christian nations of the West. He said, Jews themselves will admit that never since the Great Dispersion, so he's acknowledging the Jews were there in the Holy Land and they were dispersed in 70 AD with the Romans. Never since the Great Dispersions did Jews develop so freely and reach such an importance as in Spain when it was an Arab possession. And then when the Crusades drove them out, right? And he says, with very minor exceptions, Jews have lived for many centuries in the Middle East in complete peace and friendliness with their Arab neighbors. And so you have the leaders are more moderate because the Ottoman Empire that had been around for 700 years is gone. It was such a blow to the gut of Islam. They said, hey, Islam's, it's very similar to Japan when the atomic bomb was dropped. And the Japanese felt like not just did their emperor let them down, but their religion let them down. And so they decided they're going to open up to Western stuff. And so the Japanese began to become more Westernized after that. That's sort of what happened when the Ottoman Empire was gone. And you have Ataturk in Turkey. And he rallies, so they keep Turkey. France wanted it, but instead he rallies. It's called the Republic of Turkey. And here he is meeting with King Fazl. But look, here's Ataturk and Fazl, and they're dressed in Western clothes. And Ataturk wants to secularize Turkey. He said he is a weak ruler who needs religion to uphold his government. Even before accepting the religion of the Arabs, the Turks were a great nation. He says Mohammedanism was based on Arab nationalism above all nationalities. He says the purpose of the religion founded by Muhammad over all nations was to drag them into including Arab national politics. It might have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for a modern progressive state. So he outlaws the fezzes and the burqas. He outlaws the calls to prayer. He outlaws the Arabic language. He's is the first one to have women educated. He moves the weekend from Friday to Saturday and Sunday. He is the first one to come up with last names because they would say so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so from this town. You know, so he was a secular leader. And then the same thing happens in Iran. And the Shah of Iran loved America. There he is with Eisenhower. There he is with Truman. Right? There he is with Kennedy. There's his wife with Jacqueline. And then in Iran, in the 60s and 70s, it's westernized. The Shah loved America. I went to college with an Iranian student. He had an American flag on his dorm room wall. I hate to admit, when I went to college, I did not have an American flag on my dorm room wall. And here's Iran, 60s and 70s. It looks like Southern California, right? And the girls with their skirts. And here's Kabul, Afghanistan, girls with their skirts going to school, right? And then you have beauty pageants in Syria. And then you have Egypt, and you have King Fuad, who was a moderate, but he was, making hints that he was maybe side with Russia, and so he was toppled in a CIA-affiliated project called FF, but then in taking Fuad's place is Nasser. And Nasser is, again, more moderate. Here he is, Time Magazine. Here's women wearing stylish dresses in Egypt. Again, it looks like Southern California. Here's girls in their swimming suits in Cairo, Egypt. And here he is with his family. And Nasser says, 1958, I met with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he sat with me and made his requests. What did he request? To make wearing the hijab mandatory in Egypt and demand every woman walking the streets wear a tarha scarf. I told him my opinion was that every person in his own house decides for himself the rules. He replied, no, as a leader, you are responsible. I told him, sir, you have a daughter in the School of Medicine. She's not wearing a tarha. If you're unable to make one girl who's your daughter wear the tarha, you want me to put a tarha on 10 million women myself? And so what happened? How do we go from the Middle East becoming more westernized, and now it's fundamental? What happened? Remember this guy, the Sharif of Mecca? And his one son, Fazl's the king of Iraq. His other son, Abdullah's king of Jordan. Well, the British began to backtrack on their promises. We sort of knew that was coming. And so he hesitated on approving some stuff for the British. And the British are like, you know what? We're just going to stand back and let you get overthrown by Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. And we're going to let Saudi Arabia, the Saudi family take over Arabia. And this nice Sharif of Mecca, he's banished to the island of Cyprus. He dies in 1931, and he's buried on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in a mausoleum crypt. And Abdullah, remember Abdullah, the sort of moderate king of Jordan? He is in Jerusalem. He is praying at the Al-Aqsa Mosque when a Muslim terrorist kills him, assassinates him. And so, why is this happening? Because the Saud family are Wahhabi. And every terrorist group traces itself back to Wahhabi. And they call it Salafi teaching. And so even Lawrence of Arabia, we're not really thrilled with him, but he writes in his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, the Wahhabis, followers of fanatical Muslim heresy, had imposed their strict rules. Everything was forcibly pious, forcibly puritanical. William McCants writes, Brookings Institute scholar, Saudis promote a very toxic form of Islam that draws sharp lines between a small number of true believers and everyone else, Muslim and non-Muslim. In other words, the Wahhabis are just as happy to kill a moderate Muslim as they are to kill a non-Muslim. And so we love the person, we just don't like this Wahhabi teaching. So Abdul Aziz ibn Saud has many wives, 45 sons, and he is this fundamental cutting off the hands of thieves, female genital mutilation, and they still have today in Riyadh the Chop Chop Square. And I've talked to soldiers who've been there, and they said they push them to the front so they get to watch. And he said, well, I watched a woman get, beheaded or whatever because she was accused of rape. So all a woman has to do is be with a man who is not a relative. And they assume that he must have raped her, and if she's raped, then it's her fault, and so they kill her. And so, and we gave this quote already. And so, why is this important? Because now that the British stood back and let them take over, the Saudis take over Arabia, Mecca, the Hajj. So you have Muslims from around the world coming, and instead of getting a Hashemite, more moderate, Now they're getting infected with Wahhabism. From 1924 on, going all around the world, spreading it. And the big thing happened is 1938, Standard Oil Company, John D. Rockefeller discovers oil in Saudi Arabia. And in one generation, Saudi Arabia goes from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. And what do they do with their billions of dollars? They spread Wahhabism around the world. And then they become a magnet for fundamentalism. In other words, the other people are saying, why should we be more westernized to be blessed? Look at Saudi Arabia. They're more fundamental, and look how much money they have. And so we started the Arabian Arab Oil Company, or AMCO. And so 2 points, Wahhabis. Salafi teaching gives birth to all these groups. The first one is Muslim Brotherhood, started in 1928. PLO started by the communists and the Wahhabis. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, Al-Shabaab, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and then the Saudi oil. And so now we're into 1928. And so after, is this interesting? My time's sort of up, but I'm going to, if I can keep going, would you want me to keep going? All right, well, I'll try to make it quick. So 1922, the British flip-flop. Remember we talked about the British flip-flopping? And they issue white papers, and they say, we want to stop the Jews from going back. Instead of the Balfour Declaration, 1917, go over there. Now it's, we want to limit it. And so Paul Newman did one of his first famous movies called The Exodus, and it shows how they had to resist the British just to go back to the Holy Land. And then you have Palestine. And up until the KGB started the Palestinian Liberation Organization, up until then, the word Palestine was the Jewish homeland. And so here you have 1925 to 26, you have Palestine, land of Jewish immigration and colonization. Help the wanderer back to his own soil. And so then you have 1928, 6 employees of the British-run Suez Canal come. The French built the Suez Canal, 1882. The British take over the Suez Canal, and it is sort of like the Panama Canal, right? But it's and so you have these Muslim guys working there, 6 of them, and they form the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're Wahhabi, and they give birth to all these other groups. So what did the Muslim Brotherhood state? Started in 1920. Allah is our objective, the Quran is our constitution, Prophet is our leader, jihad is the way, death for the sake of Allah is the highest of our aspirations. And the Muslim Brotherhood bases their strategy on the 2 cities Muhammad lived in. Mecca, Muhammad was a religious leader. Medina, Muhammad becomes a political military leader. So the Muslim Brotherhood said, look, let us infiltrate every one of these countries in the Middle East where there's leaders who have become westernized, and we'll just infiltrate as religious Muslims, and then when the signal's given, boom, we become political militant and assassinate them. And so that's their plan. They come into host countries just as religious Muslims, and they're waiting and waiting and waiting until the signal's given, then they become political and militant. And now, while this is going on, the British have the mandate for the Middle East. They've given the land to the Jews, but now that Abdullah has part of the Jordan and then takes control of the Jerusalem for a while, you have the Mufti of Jerusalem, and he's Wahhabi. And you know his nephew is Yasser Arafat. But the Mufti of Jerusalem makes a treaty with Hitler. And he says, you hate the Jews, we hate the Jews. And so he helped raise an Arab legion of Muslims to fight alongside the Nazis. And then when the Jews were killed during World War II, that's when you have even FDR, and he did, turn away a ship full of Jews, the St. Louis, but he thought they were going to get off the boat in Cuba, but then they got turned away. Anyway, but FDR said, in one of the blackest crimes in all history, begun by the Nazis, the wholesale systematic murder of the Jews in Europe goes on. Jews are threatened with annihilation. And so FDR was wanting to help the Jews go back, and he does the Yalta Conference, 1945, February. At the Yalta Conference, FDR gives away half of Europe to the communists. It's like, thanks a lot, FDR. This is only 2 months before he dies. He shouldn't have been negotiating. On his way back, he's on the ship called the USS Quincy. He's coming back through the Suez Canal. He stops, visits with King Fuad of Egypt, and he visits with Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia. And supposedly, he was going to talk to them about helping the Jews go back, but he gets blindsided. And this king of Saudi Arabia says, Jews are terrible, terrible, terrible. And FDR writes back to him and says, gee, I didn't know all this. Thanks for educating me on all this history and everything. And they agree to a secret oil for security agreement where the Saudi king says, look, we will give America all the oil you can use as long as you build a military base and defend us. And so FDR goes back to America, writes a letter to him dated April 5th, 1945, promising as long as he was president, America would not recognize a Jewish state. I assure you that I would take no action in my capacity of chief of the executive with regard to the question of Palestine. A week later, FDR is finally dead. The next president's Truman, and he does recognize Israel. The story is that Truman was in World War I, and he had a Jewish friend, and they ran the PX together, and then they come back to Kansas City. They start a business together, a haberdashery, which is a men's clothing store, and his name was Eddie Jacobson. And so Harry S. Truman and Eddie Jacobson are good friends. One's a Baptist and then a Jew. And so now Truman's president. And Chaim Weizmann, who's the British say we're going to give up our mandate. Now that the United Nations is formed, we're just going to give the mandate to the United Nations. And we're going to do it on May 15th, 1948. And America was not going to recognize Israel. And so Chaim Weizmann's visiting Washington, D.C., gets a phone call. Truman gets a phone call from Eddie Jacobson, and he says, Harry, Mr. President, Harry, look, Chaim Weizmann's come halfway around the world. Just spend a few minutes with him. And because of that friendship, Truman says, okay. He meets with Chaim Weizmann, likes him. Chaim Weizmann decides, you have a chance to change the world by letting the Jews go back. And Harry S. Truman says, okay. And so the 1948 Democrat Party platform, President Truman, by granting immediate recognition to Israel, led the world in extending welcome to a people who have long sought freedom. We pledge full recognition to the state of Israel. We affirm the state of Israel to the right of self-defense. This is the Democrat Party platform. And so immediately after the recognition of Israel, all right, May 15th, 1948, the Arab countries attack. And so it's the 1948-49 war. The Jews miraculously win. And here's King Abdullah of Jordan. Remember him? It's during this 1948 war that he seizes the Temple Mount. And at first we're like upset about that, but then the Temple Mount was the rallying cry for all these Muslim countries to get together and attack Israel. And once the most moderate of the Muslim countries takes the Temple Mount and says it's already now under Arab control, it sort of took the wind out of the air out of the balloon for these other Muslim countries to say we got to wipe Israel out because we got to get the Temple Mount back, but we already have the Temple Mount. So it in a sense helped to calm the situation around. Abdullah again was a Hashemite, and he was more moderate. Who negotiates the peace treaty after the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict? But Ralph Bunche. He's the first African-American to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And so King Abdullah Jordan was at the Al-Aqsa Mosque when a Palestinian terrorist connected with the Muslim Brotherhood assassinates him. And anyway, David Ben-Gurion asks Einstein if he wants to be the second president of Israel after Chaim Weizmann, but he declined due to his age. And he says, my relationship with Jewish people became the strongest human tie. And so then we got Turkey, and we had Ataturk, secular, remember him? Now we got a new guy named Menderes, and he wants to make Turkey fundamental again, and they do the Istanbul pogrom. So you got Greek Christians in Istanbul, which used to be called Constantinople, and Menderes whips them into a frenzy, and they attack the Greek Christian neighborhoods and drive them out and so forth. And now you have the Suez Crisis. What's that? Gamal Nasser, even though he is more westernized, he decides he's going to seize the Suez Canal, which had been run by the British, even though it was built by the French, and he seizes it, and he blocks Israeli ships. And so Israel, with France, with Britain, invades, takes control of the Sinai Peninsula, takes control of the Suez Canal, and it was Eisenhower that told the Jews, look, just give up the Sinai Peninsula, and you'll have land for peace. So Eisenhower was one of the first ones to give this, give up this land that the whole entire Sinai, give it all up and you'll have peace. Well, it didn't happen. And then you have the KGB, and they're starting after World War II. Countries of Europe were trying to dig themselves out of the post-war, and the KGB would send in agents that would do critical theory, critical race theory, and it's what? It's you observe a country and identify all the groups economically, racially, religiously, socially, and you call some victims and others oppressors, haves and have-nots, and you organize protests, organize riots, you pit them against each other to create internal violence and chaos. You co-opt the media to blame the new leader of the new republic for all the problems, and when he falls in popularity, you do a coup or rigged election and you replace him with a Soviet puppet. And so the KGB would start all FARC in Colombia, and ELN in Bolivia, and FARC in Colombia, and they would, but they started the PLO. So here's, Khrushchev and Brezhnev with Yasser Arafat, and then there's Yasser Arafat with Castro, and there's Castro with, all these Brezhnev and Khrushchev, and there's Che Guevara with, Khrushchev, and the Soviets, and so now we have the Muslim Brotherhood, and it has a leader named Saeed Qutb, and he's the godfather of these terrorist groups. So as bad as the Muslim Brotherhood is, Saeed Qutb had plotted to kill Nasser, and so he's put in jail, but he influences the Ayatollah Khomeini. He influences al-Zawahiri, who starts the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. He influences Osama bin Laden. He influences the ISIS founders. And so this Saeed Qutb. And now back to Israel. After they give back the Sinai Peninsula, you have the Six-Day War. And this is all the Muslim countries decide to attack. What happens? A lot of miracles. One of them was the Egyptian Air Force. The general had wanted to have a meeting, but he decided they were going to have this famous belly dancer perform for him. And so all the generals go to this meeting, and the next morning is when the Israeli Air Force comes and bombs all the Egyptian planes that are on the runways. And the Egyptians in charge of their airfields are calling and calling, trying to reach their commander. What do we do? What do we do? They couldn't reach him because they had been at this party the night before. I mean, it was all these different things, but it was the Six-Day War that the Jews not only survived, but they take back Jerusalem and they take back the Temple Mount for the first time in 2,000 years. And here, if you look really close on the top of that mosque, what do you see? There's an Israeli flag. They had taken control of the Temple Mount. They could have kept it, but the leader, I think it was David Ben Gurion, or it was the general, Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan tells him to take the flag down. Again, sort of this land for peace. We have it, but let's give it back to him. And so then you have Golda Meir. She was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then she goes back over there, and she becomes the leader of Israel. And she is meeting with Nixon. And it's interesting, she says this in 1969, there was no such thing as Palestinians. When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? It was either southern Syria before the First World War, because it was the Ottoman Empire, and then it was Jordan. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine, considering it as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country from them. They did not exist. They were just Arabs. And so the Palestinian Liberation Organization was started by the KGB for the purpose of sowing this division over there. And so here's Rabbi Stephen Wise. He was the head of the United Palestine Appeal. He also helped found the NAACP. And so here, Palestine was associated with the Jews. Here he is meeting with Einstein. And he gave a sermon in 1925 about Jesus the Jew. And so here he was saying, look, Jesus himself was a Jew, and if we just look at him as a Jew, he was a pretty good guy. I mean, he's said a lot of really, really good things. And so this is Stephen Wise, and FDR writes to Stephen Wise as head of the United Palestinian Appeal. And it says, Dear Dr. Wise, please convey my good wishes to the National Conference for Palestine, which has been summoned by the United Palestine Appeal. The American people have watched with sympathetic interest in the effort of the Jews to renew in Palestine the ties of their ancient homeland and to reestablish the Jewish culture in the place where for centuries it flourished and from whence it was carried to the four corners of the world. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the keystone of the contemporary reconstruction activities of the Jewish homeland. Those 2 decades have witnessed a remarkable exemplification of the vitality and vision of the Jewish pioneers in Palestine. It should be a source of pride to Jewish citizens of the United States that they too have a share in the great work of this revival and restoration. It gives me great pleasure to send all those participating in your deliberations my hearty and anyway, warmest greetings, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Anyway, so you have Nixon and Kissinger, who just died. They do nothing when the fundamentalist Muslims killed 2.4 million Hindus in 1971. And then you have the Jews at the Summer Olympics being massacred in 1972 by the Muslim Brotherhood groups and all those affiliated groups. And then you have 1973, the Yom Kippur War, and the Jews survive, and they take back the Sinai Peninsula. And again, Jimmy Carter, Camp David Accords, 1978, says, look, give up the Sinai Peninsula. Give up land for peace. And he has Prime Minister Menachem Begin meet with Anwar Sadat. And they make a peace treaty. And they both receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's peace. And Anwar Sadat he's meeting with Billy Graham. Pat Robertson gave him an award. He's like, finally there's peace. But Anwar Sadat was at a parade, and the Muslim Brotherhood had infiltrated the Egyptian military, and they're walking by, and they stop in front of the bandstand, and they turn and they lower their machine guns, and they fill Anwar Sadat with machine gun bullets. Mubarak's wounded and falls off. So these leaders, if they become too much friends with the West, they get targeted by the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated groups. And so the same way that the British let Aziz ibn Saud overthrow this moderate Sharif of Mecca and let the Saud family take over Arabia, Jimmy Carter let the Ayatollah overthrow the moderate Shah of Iran. The Shah loved America. I met his son, right? And but Jimmy Carter so everything that's going on about Iran today goes back to Jimmy Carter, right? And so there he is. He abandons our ally, the Shah, and he lets the Ayatollah take over. And the Ayatollah helped start Hezbollah in Lebanon. And what happens in Lebanon? 1983, the fundamentalist Muslims blow up the U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 U.S. Marines. Reagan's response was to withdraw. Now, I talked to one of his, staffers, and he says that he wanted to stay and fight, but his generals refused to do it. But nevertheless, he pulled out. And so in Islam, weakness invites aggression. And so when your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy is weak, attack. Afghanistan. So Soviets are the enemy, right? And so we have a Soviet-Afghan war. And so the CIA, in Operation Cyclone, decides to arm and train the Taliban. In 1979 to 89, it's the largest covert operation in CIA history up to this point. And it's such a big deal that Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts did a movie on it called Charlie Wilson's War. And Sylvester Stallone did a movie on it called Rambo 3. What is covert? Covert means that the CIA is doing it, but nobody in America knows that the CIA is doing it. Could you imagine the CIA doing stuff that we don't know about? And so we're arming and training the Taliban for decades. And so the thought that the Taliban could, quote unquote, surprise us and take our biggest military base between China and Europe. And so my Uber driver one time had an accent. I said, where are you from? He goes, Afghanistan. And he says, I'm a Black Hawk helicopter pilot. I work with the Americans. I was trained by the Americans. I have my wings. I'm smart. But he says, now I'm driving Uber and making bread for Panera. And he says, we could have taken the Taliban out so easily. There was just 1,000 of them. They had motorcycles. We had Black Hawk helicopters, Javelin missiles, but we got an order to stand down. He says, my friends landed their helicopters in Tajikistan because they knew if they landed it in Afghanistan, the Taliban would kill them. He said, I had to hide for 10 days for my life finally contacted my trainer, and he was able to get me out. And he says, they were saying, well, we don't want foreigners in Afghanistan. He goes, now China runs Afghanistan for rare earth metals and lithium batteries. So Biden gave Afghanistan to China. And so then we have the Iran-Iraq war. So who now runs Iran? The Shah was ousted, so now we have the Ayatollah. We have the fundamentalist Ayatollah in Iran. Well, we don't want Iran to win the Iran-Iraq war. So what do? With Reagan, Rumsfeld, we arm and train Saddam Hussein to fight the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so Saddam was our friend. He was more westernized until George W. decided to flip the script. And he went from our friend to our enemy. And then you have Bill Clinton's president, Monica Lewinsky scandal, and he fires some missiles, and the Bosnian War starts, and he does Operation Deliberate Force, and he's funneling weapons through Iran to get to the Bosnian Muslims to fight the Serbian Christians. And there's a movie called Wag the Dog, Dustin Hoffman, Robert De Niro, about a president running for re-election caught in a sexual scandal, and they hire this Hollywood producer to fabricate a war in Albania, which borders Serbia, to draw attention away from his sexual scandal. And then you have George W., and he gets rid of Saddam and dismantles the entire infrastructure of the country. All the military personnel just go home. All the political personnel go home. Now, anybody that does any studying of when it's an authoritarian country with a king or a dictator, and you simply get rid of the king and you put in your guy. Even in the Bible, you got just King Josiah dies and he has a son Jehoahaz. And so Egypt comes, and after 3 months gets rid of the Jehoahaz, and he puts in Jehoiakim the brother, but leaves the entire structure in place and says, okay, I put you in, we want tax money. And then when Babylon comes, it gets rid of that guy, puts in another guy and says, okay, you're now our guy, we want your tax money. And so when we went in there and we totally dismantled the entire infrastructure, it left chaos, and out of that chaos came ISIS. And so David Kilcullen, former chief strategy, State Department, Office of Coordinator for Counterterrorism, says there undeniably would be no ISIS if we had not invaded Iraq. So under Obama, we let the Taliban leaders free from Guantanamo Bay. Under John Kerry, the ISIS committed genocides over in Syria and Iraq. And so we, Los Angeles Times in Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA. So we're giving guns to all these different groups. And then we take out Libya, and then they're doing gun running from Libya to Syria, and with Hillary. And we're like arming and training the terrorists. So remember Iran, the Afghan-Soviet war? And we're arming and training the Taliban. One of the Taliban fighters was named Osama bin Laden. And he starts Al-Qaeda with all the training and everything that America gave him. And we're like arming it so much, and these Christian communities are getting crushed, that Tulsi Gabbard introduces a bill saying, it's called Stop Arming Terrorists Act. It's like, hello, let's stop arming the terrorists. And so when Trump gets in, Time magazine says, President Trump ends covert plan to arm Syrian rebels. So it's like, let's stop this giving guns to the bad guys. And Trump meets with Benjamin Netanyahu, moves to the capital, recognizes the capital of Israel as Jerusalem. And then we have the Turkish leader, Ataturk, runs for office as a moderate, gets in, turns into a fundamental dictator, and then we have lots of more stuff. But then we have Afghanistan, and Biden completely pulls out and leaves all those weapons for the Taliban. And even Marjorie Taylor Greene was asking questions. Did the weapons we leave for the Taliban find their way to Hezbollah and Hamas to be used against Israel? And then all the billions of dollars that our country is giving to Iran, is any of that going to weapons to be used against Israel? And then the big thing for Iran was not the money we gave them, is that we took away the restrictions for them selling oil. And that's a gift of $50 billion a year. And then you have Ukraine. And a whole lot of the money and aid we're sending to Ukraine is going to Azov, A-Z-O-V. It's a neo-Nazi group that's basically their version of Antifa BLM. And it's intentionally to heighten the tensions because they actually want a World War III so they can do their Great Reset. And so when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, we were funneling aid to Ukraine. Ukraine's the poorest country in Europe. Guess what? The number one country in Europe, the people in the country, these oligarchs, the number one country giving money to the Clinton Foundation. Ukraine. It's the poorest country giving the most money to the Clinton Foundation? What how did they get the money? And it turns into the aid we give to these countries is money laundering. They give the money to the third world country. The corrupt leader keeps a portion of it. The rest of it gets funneled back to the politicians in America. I mean, even Zelensky, it was an article where he said that the billions of dollars that we gave him, he's giving to BlackRock and Larry Fink for management. It's like BlackRock's the number one World Economic Forum, globalist, Klaus Schwab, stuff. And so here, a whole lot of the money that we're giving, but the question is, the weapons that we have been sending over there, they're totally unaccounted for. Where are they going? And a lot of these Azov people are fundamental Muslims, and the thought is that some of those weapons could be finding their way to Hamas. And then the ceasefire thing, if you understand Islam, it's when your enemy is strong, they attack, but when your enemy stops attacking, that means that you're winning. And so when we say we're going to do a ceasefire, we are sending a signal that they're winning. That's what goes into their mind. And here's the article. Attack on Israel. Russia says NATO weapons transferred to Ukraine are being used to strike Israel. And here's this little country, 9 million Jews, surrounded by 400 million. And then they're coming to South America. They first come with their money, but now they're coming in with their groups into... So this has got percentages. This is Muslim population in Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, Suriname, and so forth. And we have now Hezbollah chapter in Venezuela, and they're infiltrating the drug gangs, and they're coming across the border by the thousands. And they're being bussed and shipped and flown to cities all across America. And so I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight. Now, I thought this was interesting. So Hamas was founded in 1985 out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the son of the founder of Hamas is Mossab Hassan Youssef. He grew up in Palestine, and he saw how ruthlessly the Hamas terrorized their own citizens. In other words, they were friends of his, that the Hamas accused them of working together with the Jews. And he saw them tortured to death. And he goes, I know them. They weren't working with the Jews. And he saw that his people were torturing these poor people to death. And he says, you know what? If this is the way they act before they get in control, what are they going to do once they're in control? And so from 1997 to 2007, Youssef secretly warned Israelis of impending suicide attacks to save their lives. And they eventually became a Christian, and then he escaped to America, and he wrote a book called Son of Hamas. I met him, interviewed him. So Youssef explained in a CBN interview, May 22nd, 2010, my problem is with the God of the Quran. If we compare his personality to the God of the Bible, we will find the difference. From their fruits, we know them. The fruits of the God of the Quran is terrorism, beating women, killing children. My transformation took 6 years of study. It was not overnight. I had to study Christianity and other religions. I considered at some point not to believe in any religion. The only path I found peace, which was good for me and good for all mankind, was Jesus Christ. So I have a book and a DVD. You've been so kind to listen to me for so long, and so I'll end with that. God bless you.
Wow. We could watch that video over and over again. And thanks to Dennis Whipple in the back, you can get the DVD of this. and share it with your kids and your grandkids and your neighbors. So thank you so much for coming tonight. We so appreciate it. We have information on the tables, and so please go to the tables and look over what we have. We have 20 bonus handouts today, and so the first ones that go to the membership table get those. And David Lehman, I think he left his materials on his table, and feel free to go to Bill's table, and he has some books at his table as well. Thank you so much for coming. God bless you. Bye.